Hello, everyone. So I'm Mateusz. I work as Android tech lead at IG in Krakow, Poland. I also co-organize the GDG Krakow meetups. I know that you have a GDG here in St. Petersburg as well, so no introduction needed. I'm also the member of the Google Developer Expert Program on Android. I'm a fresh father of twins. Not that fresh, they are a year and a half old. Lovely. You can find me on Twitter, but I'm tweeting mostly about politics, so you'll not find anything there. Anyways, you've been told lies about Fragments. So how many of you are using Fragments? Raise your hand. Everyone, I love it. So basically, 3 months ago, when I was asked for a topic, and I was thinking, what topic can I deliver? And I have kind of a rule that for each year, I'm going to the new conference like somewhere in April and spring, and I'm always doing a new topic. So I was thinking about something new based on the experience that I earned over the last year. And I thought, all right, so I'm super pissed off on Fragments. Let's try to refactor our application to use the custom views, and then after 3 months, it's going to be done because it's a simple task, right? I will deliver a talk to tell you that fragments are not needed and are causing only troubles. So I started doing that. I'm not that sure about it anyway. So during this presentation, we'll try to answer this question, whether custom views are all that you need. So the goals of this talk, the agenda of this talk is that first, I'll tell you why fragments are bad. Then I will tell you that you can do nothing about it. And then I will tell you that finally, actually, you can do something about it if you really, really want. So the goals of this talk, I know that not everyone is working on a greenfield project every 3 months, right? So probably for somebody who is like working on the application that started like 5 years ago, and you already have like 100 fragments in your code base, including like 7 base fragment classes, right? This presentation is not going to make you leave this room and refactor your codes, try away and get rid of them. This is not going to happen. Everyone who can tell you something that, okay, I will convince you that you should get rid of them, will actually lie. And for those of you who are starting a greenfield project, I will give you an idea about the possible alternatives available in the community and in the Android development nowadays, so you can actually rethink your approach before you start something new. So, what's so bad about fragments? There are a lot of articles, right? You probably know this article, Advocating Against Android Fragments. It's 2 or 3 years old by Square. This is basically how it all started. So the Square employee wrote a blog post, like pretty extensive and pretty good, to be honest, telling you why fragments are bad and why Square resigned from in their applications. There's also the article, also very good, from the guy from Warsaw working for Software Mill, also using the actually same arguments why you should get rid of them. And both of those posts, and actually majority of them, because those are not the only 2, are telling you that the problem with fragments is that you have a huge life cycle. This is intended that you can see nothing on this slide, right? There is like a gazillion of callbacks that fragment let you override, right? But actually, is that really a problem? Is the number of callbacks really a problem, right? So to me, there is too much drama on the internet about the number of callbacks, right? So basically, it's even good that that Fragment API actually exposes you a way to plug into every single piece of their life cycle. This is fine. However, the real issue that I found, that is issue to me, is the unexpected behavior of fragments and unexpected behavior of those callbacks. So I'll tell you a story of an app that we are writing over the last couple of months. So that was a news application, and we basically had the structure on the view looked more or less like this. And on the other end, we had a single response from the API that was basically backing all those fragments, right? So those fragments were basically having some kind of a short list, displaying the news for one particular region of the world. And we had a one single endpoint that was exposing this data. So we had a presenter and we decided, all right, let's make those pieces on the UI fragments, right? We've been told that fragments are nice, you can reuse them, and so on and so on. So let's use them in this place. Or, yeah, we had the presenter, we had the activity, which was implementing the view. We are using the MVP pattern, but it's not important in this particular case. And on the activity, we had the method set US news, set EU news, and set Asia news, right? And then activity, when you were invoking those methods, were performing find fragment by tag and setting the items on the particular fragment that actually needed to display this particular piece of the response. And this is actually the important point. Response was cached in memory once done, right? So when you left the application and you entered it again and the process was still in memory, the response was cached. So basically, you didn't need to request for it again. We could display the data to the user straight away. The same for the problem with changing the orientation. So what's the problem? So the question to the audience, most of the problem in Android apps start with changing the orientation, exactly. Just slightly moving your wheels and millions of problems automatically appear. So basically, what was the problem? We are attaching the view to our presenter in activity on create, right? The fragments were cached because FragmentManager is doing that for us automatically. I will talk about it later on. And data was cached, so basically attaching the view to the presenter caused the immediate call to activity set data. Right? So we are attaching the view, we are checking data is there, all right, set data, no reason to wait. And activity set data was basically just as I drew on the diagram before, was finding the fragment that was interested in displaying this particular piece of data and calling the set data on this particular fragment, right? Oh, and that was bad. So view wasn't yet created in activity on create. So we received a null pointer exception inside of the fragment because we tried to invoke a method on the recycler view. Bam, doesn't work, crash. And the problem is that actually, I'm sure every one of you know, the fragment transactions are asynchronous, right? And this is not a problem on its own, but this asynchronous nature of the fragment transaction causes them to be totally unexpectable. So this was basically the code that we had, and I have a small quiz. So I'm attaching the fragment like this, right? I'm attaching it only during the first entrance to this activity. No rotation changes and everything. This is why I have the save instance state null, because as I said, FragmentManager is remembering that for you. So now, there is a quiz. So what happens when you rotate your screen and you have the main fragment already attached to the FragmentManager, right? So we have a set of methods like this. We have the fragment on attach, fragment on create view. And on the other side, we have activity on create and activity on start. So obviously, the first method that it's called is activity on create, right? So now the question to you guys, what will be invoked next from those methods? If I have activity on create, in super on create, what will happen next if I have the fragment attached from the previous configuration? On attach, point for you. Next. On create. Minus point for you. And now's the real crap coming. Yeah, this is not retained fragment. Let's say sorry for the code missing. On create view, no, actually activity on start, and then activity, and this is how activity on start look in the framework, in the fragment activity, right? You can base M fragments is actually representing your fragment manager, because what's the point of calling the fragments a fragment manager, right? We can call it fragments. And we invoke the exec pending actions, and this is happening in on start. So basically, your views are not created before on start of the activity. All right, commit now. How many of you know it? Added to the support library 2400. All right, good. So the thing is, so I'm invoking the exact same fragment transaction right now. The only difference is that instead of using commit, I'm using commit now. Bam, bam, bam. The same behavior. Still asynchronous, sorry. So, however, if you do it in on start, and I have like a before transaction, and I have the after transaction log, right? And I'm committing the transaction. So you can basically pretty easily derive what will happen. I will have before transaction, after transaction. The fragment transaction is going to be added at the end of the looper queue, and it's going to be executed after basically Android finishes with what it already need to finish on the UI queue. If I have a commit now here, the behavior is different. So if you invoke it after on start and before on stop, and you commit your transaction with commit now, what you will get is actually the synchronous transactions. So basically, you commit now, and after the commit now line finishes, returns, you can rely on the fact that your fragment has already the view created, it's attached, and it's ready to go, right? So, and basically there is a bug created on the issue tracker telling that, all right, so the commit now works differently in onCreate and in onStart. Can you do something about it so it's more predictable? No, works as intended. So basically, if you imagine how this issue tracker works on the other side, right? When somebody is reading it, I kind of imagine that there is like a huge button work as intended and a small one comment. So there are plenty of issues like this. So basically, this ugly diagram presents more or less what is happening, what I think is happening, because you can never be sure. So we have activity on create, actually fragment activity on create, which underneath is calling your fragment on attach in case there is a fragment, in case there is some fragment attached from the previous configuration. Then fragment on create, and I added also the behavior of the nested fragments here, right? So if you have a nested fragment attached to your parent fragment that you display in the activity, the onAttach and onCreate on this nested fragment will be called within the fragments on create, right? Activity on start, which calls activity on create, activity on view created, and on activity created indirectly through the method perform activity created, which will also create your nested fragments. Pretty complex to me as well, I know that. So, so basically, from this, you can safely rely that the first callback in which you can rely, inside of the activity in which you can rely your fragments are populated together with their views, is activity on start. The same goes for fragments and the nested fragments. The very first callbacks you can rely that your nested fragments views are created is basically fragment on start. However, there is an exception. Declaring fragments in XML sit tight, because this is a nightmare. So basically, you are attaching a fragment like this, right? So how the underneath implementation of this behavior is looking like, the fragment manager implements something called layout inflator factory. So basically, not everyone knows that, but you can actually take the default Android's layout inflator that you have in the framework, override its behavior, and for example, populate your own tags into the XML. This is exactly how populating the fragments from the XML file work, right? And this is basically a piece of code. So you basically see that the first line of this onCreate view within the fragment manager is basically checking whether the tag name is fragment. If not, then fall back to default behavior. I'm not interested in that. If it's fragment, then carry on, right? And then this method is actually 200 lines long, and it has something like this. And you look on it, and you start thinking. So basically, this diagram doesn't make sense anymore. Because if you attach your fragments from the XML file, your views are created within activity on create. Totally different behavior. Yeah, I just said that. So the conclusions, as I said, on start is the earliest callback in activity. Same as in fragment. If you use fragments in the XML file, you are in trouble. You cannot rely on that. So how many of you attach fragments from the XML file? All right, I'm not saying to not do that. Actually, the behavior of them is much more predictable than the fragments from the code, right? All right. So the solution, one of the solution was to move the presenter on attach view to on star, and this is basically how we work around this issue. All right, another story, ViewPager. ViewPager and Fragments, fun. And we had a problem tracking screens to Google Analytics, right? So basically we had the ViewPager, it was displaying 3 tabs, and when you were switching through those tabs, we wanted to display that. We wanted to track the event to Google Analytics telling that the user visited this screen. There's also another issue, so imagine that you are displaying some kind of a tutorial, right? Some showcase, and when you are entering some particular tab for the first time, you want to highlight some piece of the view and tell the user what to do with it, right? So, there's the method setUserVisibleHint. How many of you know it? All right, so you can basically override. You receive a Boolean telling you whether this fragment is now visible to the user within the ViewPager or not. The thing with it is that this is actually the FragmentPager Adapter code, the internal code from the support library. And this is the only place inside of the framework and the support library that is calling this method. It's not anywhere else. It's not never called from the FragmentManager. The only use case for setUserVisibleHint is basically the ViewPager. And it's completely untied to the regular Fragments lifecycle. It's basically living on the side. So basically setUserVisibleHint can be called before or after your view is created. It can be called before or after your fragment is attached to the activity, right? So this basically makes you do something like this. You have a setUserVisibleHint. The fragment stores the value. There is the internal flag. Then you have the onResume on start. And then you basically track screen, maybe, if both of the conditions are met. So this is actually the fragment piece of code that is taken from our project. I'm interested if somebody had something similar in their code bases. All right. Oof. That means that doesn't have a bug if there are more people. All right, another problem. I have a heavy view and I don't want to destroy when I navigate, right? So you are clicking on some button and you want to move from one fragment to another. But on the other hand, this particular fragment that you want now to push to the backstack and to hide from the user is actually heavy enough that you don't want to recreate each time user navigates back because, for example, it's killing your animation, right? So basically this diagram, heavy fragment A, fragment B. So there are 3 pairs of the methods that you can basically use in this case. So basically there is show and hide, attach and detach, and add and remove, or just using replace, which is underneath using the add and remove. So which of those 3 would you use in case you want to hide the fragment but not destroy the view? Hide show, exactly, good answer. So, and basically, on the other hand, this is the fragment from the Android documentation telling you that, all right, so when your fragment is not visible, the onStop or endOnPause are being called, right? It's not the case when you are showing and hiding your fragments using the fragment transaction because hidden fragment is still in the running state, so you don't receive the onPause. And instead, you receive yet another method which is called onHiddenChanged, which also receives the Boolean, which also you need to override and basically perform some stuff based on this behavior. But when you rotate the screen, you will not receive it, right? You will need to rely on the isHidden method instead rather than calling this callback. Stuff becomes complicated. Now imagine that you are performing show and hide within the ViewPager, nested fragments, retained fragments. Oh, come on, you're asking for trouble. Oh, basically, another thing bad about fragments is debugging, right? You all know this. Some stuff is not working, fragments are overlapping, you are setting up some breakpoint, clicking on this arrow and going through line, through line, through line, and then you hit hell. The other name for hell is FragmentManager implementation. That is, all right, I'm done here. Let's just paste the stack trace to the Stack Overflow and see what happens. So, couple of lessons learned. So basically, Google had kind of a set of rules how we can use C++ and which features of the C++ we want to use and which features we don't want to use. We had the exact same thing from Fragments to actually predict what is happening in our application. So we don't use fragments in case they don't work on our own, which means in the MVP pattern, in case you don't have the presenter for this fragment and it's basically just waiting and relying on some external entity like activity to pass the data from the outside, probably you can just survive with the custom views. And if you need to talk to your fragment from the activity or the parent fragment, so basically find the fragment into the FragmentManager, give it a second thought, because in case you don't really know FragmentManager, like other side of your hand, this might cause trouble because you don't know which state is currently this fragment running in. And the custom views are working fine for us, right? You saw the diagram at the beginning of the presentation. This could be done with custom views. We refactor it to use custom views, and we are now much happier people. So basically, calling get activity from the fragment, if you know what you are doing, still is more safe. We consider it more safe because you know what state the fragment is running at the moment, so you can rely more or less that the get activity will be null at this case or not. Same for get target fragment and get parent fragment in case you are using nested fragments, right? If you are inside of the fragment, you can understand what is the state of this fragment in the easier manner than when you are calling it from the outside. So, yeah. Okay. So, the core of this presentation, do we need fragments at all? And the thing is that fragments have some advantages as well. So it's not just I'm complaining about them. Let's talk about stuff that is done well and the fragments are doing for you. Obviously, backstacks animations, right? So if you decide to go for a custom views and not use any other framework for that, you are on your own. You implement it on your own. Retaining the state, retaining on configuration changes, and I'm not talking about the retained fragments here. I'm talking about just retaining the state of your backstack, returning the state of the fragments being attached to some particular view ID, right? This is good. Basically, some of you probably use the dialog fragment. It's really pretty convenient that you can basically show the dialog fragment. You can forget about it. You know that when you rotate your screen, it's still going to be there. That's nice. Request permissions start activity for result. So basically, if you are starting activity for result or request for the permissions, the callback that you get back, like on request permission result or on activity result, is delivered to only this particular fragment that requested for it, right? Finally, because this didn't always work, especially for the nested fragments once they were released. So basically, there is no need to delegate stuff from your activity to the fragment. This is nice. By the way, do you know how it's done? Underneath. So basically, you call start fragment for result with some intent and particular request code. This is dispatched to the fragment activity as start activity for result with 65536. So it's basically 16 bits plus 1. And then on activity result is called again on the fragment activity with this particular request code. And then a fragment activity delegates it to the fragment with this particular request code in there. Totally useless knowledge, but it's nice to know. You can impress on a date or something. So half of the bits that you use in the integer are used to identify the fragment that requested for it. Pretty smart. When I saw it, I was really impressed. So when you, for example, use integer max value when you are doing start activity from result from your fragments, you are basically getting a crash, but nobody does it, to be honest. All right, and another thing which is good, they are in the sample library, right? So once there is, so basically, if there would be a bug in the SDK, it would be locked to this bug ever. Like nobody would care about the fixes for the next 5 years. Because basically, once the bug is released to the phones, it's going to stay there forever. Always, if you are using fragments, always use fragments from the supportlib, because otherwise, you are resigning from some features, like nested fragments, and you are resigning from bug fixes. You should always use the supportlib, no matter what your main SDK code is. And probably the most important point, when I ask you the question, how many people are using fragments here? Everyone almost raised their hands, right? If I have a problem with fragments, some illegal state exception called within on activity result, I just put it on Stack Overflow, and there is 10,000 people with the same problem, right? So it's really easy to find a solution. And if you are going for something super customized, that's not that easy. That's a different story. And communication to parent and target fragment is done pretty nicely. The set target fragment is retained on the configuration changes. So this is especially handy for dialogues. So imagine you are showing a dialog fragment with 3 buttons at the bottom, and basically you need to deliver some result to some target fragment that is displayed in the background at the current moment, right? So when you rotate the screen, you have to do nothing. The target fragment will be, or parent fragment will be retained, and your callback will actually be delivered still without you doing anything and any other code. Viewless fragments. This is actually a nice thing. How many of you use fragments that don't have views? All right, I saw some solutions that are actually using them for wrapping some asynchronous stuff. I don't think this is anymore needed. Not many of us still use async tasks with the risk of the memory leak. But we have this case, right? We have multiple activities within our application. And most of those activities, like 7 of them, basically displayed the current balance on the toolbar in one of our trading applications, right? And this current balance was changing in the real time because that was a trading app. So basically there was a presenter which was connecting to the WebSocket, and it was delivering the values continuously. And then the fragment that didn't have any view had the reference to the activity, right? So basically it looked more or less like this. We had the set current balance implemented on the balance view that was doing get activities, the title. So basically the only thing, once we done that, to achieve the behavior of adding the balance to the activity was to just add this fragment on the first run of this activity, and the behavior was there. Right? It's like building from blocks. Pretty nice. Nested fragments are sometimes helpful. So imagine you have the Instagram application, right? There are several tabs at the bottom, and basically each of those tabs has their own backstack. Child FragmentManager works pretty nice for this. And if you go for your custom views, you will notice that there is a difference in the number of callbacks. So basically on the views, you have like on attached to window and on detached from window, which are not necessarily called not necessarily tied that obviously to the activity lifecycle. So for example, on attached to window will be called during the onStart, then on detached from window will be called during the onDestroy. So if you need to stop some operation, for example, streaming operation during the onStop, you are left with your own delegating the onStop to your views manually. So long story short, those 8 points, I think there were 8, are not something that you should be writing on your own, right? So I started to look for alternatives. So the requirements for the alternative that I wanted to have, supporting backstack, obviously, not something that I would like to write myself. Synchronous transactions. So basically, as I said, the biggest problem I have with fragments is basically their asynchronous nature. So I wanted it to be predictable. I invoke some line of code, and I can rely that the view is created. Retaining state of the configuration changes, that's a must-have. I don't want to do it manually for every single activity that I have. Some set target fragment qualifying would be nice, so I can basically communicate between 2 different pieces of the UI. And fragment-like support for request permissions and StartActivityForResult, right? So there is often some piece of the UI that you display in many places, like imagine the Hangouts bottom bar, which contains the microphone icon on something, and you would like to have the logic that is actually requesting for a permission and also handling the permission result in one place so you can attach it everywhere. I wanted this to be in my solution as well. And well-maintained and reasonably big user base. So I didn't expect for this solution to actually be used by so many people as fragments are, but I wanted to somebody actually use it. I didn't want to go for a solution that has 5 stars on GitHub because I would know that it's going to be abandoned after 2 months. So basically, as you may have noticed, what I needed were fragments, but synchronous and predictable. End of presentation, try Conductor, is great. All right, I'm going to show you some tricks. So basically, there are multiple solutions. There is Flow and more from Square. There is Pilot, I guess. I gave it a try as well. But nothing really seemed so much promising and so much close to Fragments, killing my problems at the same time like Conductor did. Basically, I went to the repository, went to the README, easy integration, said, okay, I'm solved, right? And single activity apps without fragments, I didn't really need that. But there are some other things like that you can basically see on the slide. So in Conductor, when you start using Conductor, that's actually the link to the GitHub repository. There is a demo up in there. You can try it yourself. There are a lot of use cases for fragments that you can actually solve in a different way when you're using Conductor. So controllers are your new fragments, and this is the lifecycle of the controller. What is different from the fragments lifecycle is that it can actually fit on the slide. Good. There is some naming difference. So basically, on attach and on detach means the view is attached, right? So this fragment is now in focus in the running state. It's a bit different than fragments, but it's not actually a huge change. And if you take a look on the base controller implementation, those are the methods that you have, the lifecycle methods. They are pretty similar to what you have in fragments. There is no onCreate, you might notice, because the constructor is actually used as onCreate. And there are some other things as well that you might use from your fragments. It has options menu, onCreate options menu. You have get activity, StartActivityForResult, and activity result. Basically, everything is there, right? So basically, for some of the cases when I started using it, migrating to Conductor was just changing extends fragment to extends controller, and then changing on start to on attach. And that was it, right? Pretty nice. So basically, let's take a look at some code. So this is basically activity on create code. So you are attaching your router, you're passing the save instance state, and you are getting a router object. This has root controller is basically the equivalent of checking the save instance, whether the save instance state is null or not. And then you are attaching some controller via the transaction. And the super cool thing, no matter when you are invoking this, after this line, I can even write on the next line in this if, your view is created, your controller is attached, everything works, you can rely on it, it always behaves in the same way, no matter what you call it. It supports the nested controllers, so imagine I'm invoking this transaction and I have a home controller, and then in onCreate view, inside of my home controller, I am attaching some child controller, right? Also, after this line, all my child controllers and all the nested transactions are synchronous as well. So you invoke one line and it's there. Another thing is that, as somebody noticed, fragment can be either a retained instance or not, right? And the retained instance fragment is basically a fragment when you have the single instance of the fragment, which is connected to different instances of the view depending on how fast you rotate your screen. For Conductor, this is a default behavior. So all the controller objects are retained on the configuration changes. Right? So I added a small log in here, on attach. So you see that I received a view here. I rotate my screen. Sorry. So this is what happens when I attach it for the first time. This happens when I attach it for the second time after rotating my screen. The very same instance. The best thing about it, you cannot change this behavior. One behavior, rule them all. And you don't need anything else. Those controllers are super light. No need to destroy them when you rotate your screen. Interesting fact, fun fact. So basically, how this retaining is done is basically Conductor is attaching the fragment to your activity, which is retained, and then it's keeping all the state. Irony. So basically, if you are using Conductor, you will not get rid of fragments because there will be at least one somewhere underneath. Still, despite the fact that those controller objects are retained, and this is also pretty similar behavior to the retained fragments, you need to override your own save view state. This is equivalent of the fragments on save instance state. Because if you, for example, have don't keep activities, or you navigate out of the application using the home button, starting reading Chrome, and Android decides, all right, it's time to kill this activity because I'm running out of resources, your instances will be killed as well, both fragments and the controllers, right? So basically, you still need this on-save view state to save your state. There is some default behavior for controllers, so you don't need to care about the internal details. You just need to store the stuff that is not stored for you by default by the views, for example. Another thing. So this is actually the example from the demo application. So you have a target screen, and there are two buttons at the bottom, right? And peak title. I tap on the peak title. I go here. I type stuff in there. I've been told that I cannot move from the camera, so I will not tap on this one. But you type some stuff over here, and you move back, and your title is displayed. Pretty similar behavior to what either get parent fragment if you use nested fragments, or target fragment is basically doing. So basically, this is the code. You are performing a new fragment, new control transaction, pardon, and those push change handler and pop change handler are actually responsible here for the animations, right? There are some built-in animations that you have in Conductor. You can override the proper interface. You can have a custom one, and basically you have 2 instead of 4, right? You have the same animation no matter when your fragment is moved from back stack or just detached from the view. You basically have only one behavior in here, right? This is how you set target controller in basically this child controller, and this is what happens when you pick some option. You write there in the edit text, and then you tap on the button, use this title. This is what happens, right? You take the target controller, you cast it to some interface, and then you basically invoke on this interface the on title picked, and you pop the transaction, so it's basically moving out of the screen. And that's the implementation of the target controller, which is basically using this title, right? So it's pretty convenient. Target controller can be in any router, right? Router is basically your equivalent of the FragmentManager. So no matter if it's a nested controller or not, everything can be target controller for everything, and the behavior will be always the same. So wait, what? Null check, right? You might notice this. Am I back to the fragments? Hell. Conductor by default, when you are navigating and performing some transactions like pushing new controller to the front, is destroying your view, which is not yet display. So basically, when this is this child controller, and when you are invoking this method, the parent one is in the background, so the view is destroyed. So you need to perform this null check. However, there is a method on the controller, set retain view mode, which is accepting 2 enums. One is retain detach, and then there is basically this retain detach, which basically causes your controller to not lose the view when you are navigating back. Interestingly, it's not changing your lifecycle at all. You will just receive in on attach the same instance as you had previously. It's not going to be recreated, but the lifecycle stays the same no matter what you said. How much time do I have? Okay, we'll make it. StartActivityForResult. So basically, this is how it works. I told you about all this bits magic. Obviously, Conductor is doing that in a much simpler manner. It's not that hard to be simpler than FragmentManager. So basically, this is the internal implementation of the framework. You are getting the request code. You are mapping it to the instance ID. Instance ID is the internal implementation detail of Conductor. During the first creation of this controller, it's basically generating the UID and storing in the field, and then is retained when your activity gets killed, for example. And then you receive an activity result. So you basically take the sparse array or a map, and you take the instance ID, and then you invoke the method on the router to actually find me the controller with this particular instance ID. What I want to say by that, why I'm showing you this code, I want to show you that actually, if you run in trouble with Conductor, it's amazingly easy to debug. It's amazingly easy to debug. This code is super simple. All the methods there are more or less like this. Easy to understand, no bit operations, cool stuff. And then you get on activity result, you see that only the controller that actually requested for the permission or requested for the activity result gets the callback. So you don't need to basically have some implementation in your controller that are checking whether this is the request code that you requested for. Goes recursively, so if you invoke it from some child controller or child of child of child, child of child, it will be found and your callback will be delivered. ViewPager, you might notice there is no visibility callback in controllers whatsoever, right? So, which means that when you have the off-screen page limit, like by default 1, so two controllers are attached at the same time, and you cannot distinguish between them. You don't really know which of them is currently displayed within the ViewPager. And my first reaction to them is even worse than Fragments, right? Okay, I need to say sorry to say user visible hint. It was better. Not really. So this is this router pager adapter, which is the part of the Conductor framework. And this is the default implementation that you have visible in the demo application that I shared as a link on one of my slides. And there is a set primary item that you can override in your adapter. And you can call this. You can create your own callback. And what is interesting in that, you can be always sure that the view is created there. So you have a full control over it. No weird behavior. Right? So if you need this behavior, because you don't need it everywhere, if you need this behavior, 4 lines of code and you are done. And it will always work, no null pointer exceptions whatsoever. These advantages of Conductor, right? So it's not like all the solutions are perfect. Controllers must have views and need to be attached to some container, right? So basically, the solution I told you with the viewless fragments, sorry, will not work with Conductor because I need to attach it to some view and it needs to create some view, right? Sometimes using fragments is easier or necessary, like support map fragment or dialog fragment, right? There are some items in the Conductor. If you take a look on the pull request, you will see that some people are doing some base implementations for the dialog controller. But because of the first point, actually, they are doing some hacks, right? So they are creating some view that is attached to one visible container. Then they are displaying this dialog. This is basically the consequence of the decision that was made that, all right, we need it to be damn simple, right? And in case you need something extraordinary, you will need to hack it around or fall back to Fragments. Userbase is still not even comparable to Fragments. So when I was coding, and I noticed that it's a bit problematic to find something in Google when something is not working the way you would expect. The good thing is that, first of all, it's not happening that often because it's super easy to read the code and super easy to basically deduct what is happening underneath. And also, the Conductor author is super responsive on GitHub. So it's not like you are creating the issue in the issue tracker, you wait 2 weeks and it's work as intended and no comment. The guy is really, really responsive. I was impressed how much time he needs to put into this library so it's basically still working and still being developed. So a couple of conclusions. For majority of apps, Fragment can't easily be exchanged to custom views. Right? If you need those features I shared with as a good parts of the Fragment, you will struggle to actually exchange them for just custom views. You can, but you will find yourself reinventing the wheel in a couple of places. Fragments are okay-ish if you use them carefully and understand how they work. And this is actually the problem because you can recognize a good API by the fact that it's actually hard to break, right? So FragmentManager is not a good API because you need to read this kind of a book to actually make sure that you are never shooting on your knee. Lots of issues in Fragments that we are complaining about are actually the bugs. No solution like neither Conductor or anything else are free from bugs. It will be happening that you will receive some internal null pointer exception because of some stupid crap, and you will need to work around it, because bugs is something that is basically happening in our industry. And the most important thing that you need to take from this presentation, don't follow blindly someone telling you that X sucks and you shouldn't use it, right? No matter what is it, no matter who is saying that, no matter if it's Square, no matter if it's Google, you should always take the blog post or the video or the conference presentation of some fat guy from Poland with the salt of grain and saying, is this applicable for my project? Is this really going to to make my life easier, right? So always think about your project and always think about your use case, because they're infinite. Like there is millions of use cases, and when you see the presentation or read the blog post, they are talking about just some of them. So, thank you. That was it I wanted to share. I think we have some time for questions.
One.
There is a question.
If you have any questions, you can raise them.
There is a question over there.
I'm sorry for my bad English. And
no worries.
Can I use Conductor and this method in not in activity and fragments environment? For example, custom input method service keyboard.
No, it will not work. So basically, there was the line when you were attaching the router, it was expecting the activity. Controllers can be attached to activities only, and they rely on the activity lifecycle a bit underneath as the internal part. So basically, in case you want to attach it to the service or somewhere else, you can do that with Fragments, you cannot do that with Conductor.
Thank you.
I think one of the common use of Fragments is using with navigation view. I haven't used to use this Conductor library, so does it works well with navigation view?
Yeah, so there is basically this demo application, and from what I remember, there is an example with the navigation view that we can go to the speaker's room and we can actually take a look how it's being implemented underneath.
Yeah, I have a question about controller callbacks. So there is an object, if I understand.
Let's take a look.
Could you scroll back to the
200 slides. No kidding.
I have a question about controller callback. When you put some controller into transaction, and we can send event back to the previous controller. Should this object be public, static, or it should be any object?
You mean target controller? Whether it should be?
Yes.
Yeah, it needs to be public because in case your not because of the target controllers, but they need to be public because, or at least exposed to the package, because Conductor is actually recreating them using their names, right?
Yeah. So, and in this case, this object should be static. It shouldn't be inner class, because if it's inner class and it's not static, when we recreate new object, this new object didn't have link to the parent.
Yeah, this is the same for the fragments, I guess, when you're recreating them, that they need to be static classes because otherwise they are not able to recreate them using the reflection.
Yes, and in this case, we cannot to use view links to the view objects.
From the parent fragments or from
the child object.
Well, you can use them. You can use them by the reference. So as on the example I provided, wait a sec. Yeah. So you can basically do it like this, right? So you basically take the controller, and you are invoking some kind of a method on this controller, and then this controller has the method on the view. So indirect communication with the views of the parent.
Yeah, and in the case when view was recreated, TLV selection will be null.
Yeah, this is why this demo example has this selected text variable, which is being retained. So basically, then when your view is created, they are using this. This is string. Selected text is string. Yeah. So it's stored on the orientation change. So if you don't have a view, you cannot set it. But when the view appears, you are basically setting it from the variable. But this is the case only for the situation when you don't have this. Because if you have this, you can rely on your view being there in the created state when you are basically invoking the methods.
Say set retain view mode. So in this case, view will not be destroyed, correct?
Yes.
But if a system kill activity and recreate it.
Yeah, but then it will be, of course, it will be destroyed. Also on the orientation changes, it will be destroyed because the views are referencing your activity in the previous configuration, right? So you need to recreate them. We can actually go afterwards and try to debug a bit and see the callbacks.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
No worries.
Тут попросили передать, что напротив нашей площадки эвакуируют машины. Если у вас есть такая, то, собственно, лучше проверить.
Guys, if somebody of you park your car near this building, there is some cars was evacuated. So check your car. So, more questions?
In case our operation was destroyed and recreated, does the Conductor recreate controllers, and is there a same restriction on constructor of controller as Fragment constructor?
Yeah, the same restriction appear. So basically, there was this code. So basically, you are passing the safe instance state, right, to this router. So in case you don't have the access to the previous custom non-configuration object, then it's taking from the instance state the state of the backstack, the state of the names of the controllers, and is recreating them. So the same restriction appears as on the fragments.
Okay, and there is a mechanism to pass arguments to controllers.
Yes, there is a mechanism to pass the arguments to controllers. I haven't shown it's there on the demo, and those arguments are basically the bundle, just like in the fragment, and they are retained on the configuration changes as well.
And one more question: Conductor backstack works similar to Fragment backstack, or we can skip some previous controllers when we want to back to very far for 5 screens, 100 screens in one action.
So you are basically talking about the case when you are putting the string into add to backstack and then you are popping to this particular place, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So basically, there is a method to pop your the controller to some particular place. So basically, you can do it free at the time if you need.
And when we rewind several controllers, does its views will be created and destroyed?
Depending on this flag that I was showing, depending whether you set it to retain or detach, this will basically either be destroyed or saved. So you are deciding on your own, depending whether you can afford destroying the view or not. There are two values that you can pass. Either you are deciding that it will stay, or you are deciding that it will be destroyed. That's your decision. Doing it in one setter, and the value is actually retained on the orientation changes as well.
Okay, thank you.
More questions?
One question over there.
And about fragments, what common use cases for them do you use in your application, not using Conductor, for example?
All right, so as I said, one is this headless fragment that was basically displaying a balance. The other thing is that when you have some particular piece of the UI logic together with some business logic that is delegated to the presenter, right? And it sometimes needs you to request for the permission or start activity for result if you want to pick the contact or something. So fragments are pretty handy for such cases. If despite the fact that you need the rough view, you also need some logic related to that and possibly tie it also to the life cycle of the activity. But you need to do it in a couple of places, in a couple of activities, for example, right? Then you basically can treat the fragment as a building block or a controller as a building block that you can attach to some activity, and it will have not only the view, not only the appearance, but also the behavior.